The theater lights dimmed slowly, leaving the stage bathed in a soft golden glow. The crowd hushed, the quiet hum of anticipation filling the air like static before a storm. It was one of those nights when something special was expected to happen, though no one could quite explain why. The posters outside had only said one thing: a masked pianist will perform tonight. No name, no background, nothing else. Just that. People had come out of curiosity more than anything. Some thought it was a publicity trick by the organizers to sell tickets. Others believed it might be a famous artist trying to create a bit of mystery before a comeback. But when the curtain finally moved, and the masked pianist stepped into the light, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. She was dressed simply. No glitter, no heavy gown. Just a long black dress that touched the floor and shimmered faintly when she walked. A thin silver mask covered the upper half of her face, catching the reflection of the stage lights like a secret she wasn't ready to share. Her movements were calm but measured, as if each step carried a story the audience couldn't see yet. There was something both fragile and powerful about her presence. Even from a distance, people sensed a quiet intensity in the way she carried herself. A whisper spread among the crowd. Some leaned toward each other, trying to guess who she might be. "Do you think she's someone famous?" Someone in the front row murmured. "Maybe. Or maybe she's just trying to get attention," another replied with a shrug. But despite the low chatter, everyone's eyes stayed fixed on her as she approached the grand piano at the center of the stage. It stood there like a sleeping giant, black, polished, and waiting. She ran her fingers lightly across its edge before sitting down. The hall went completely silent. You could hear the faint rustle of someone adjusting their coat, a cough from the back row, and then nothing else. She took a deep breath, her gloved hands resting above the keys but not touching them yet. For a long moment she didn't move. The audience began to grow restless. A few eyebrows lifted, wondering if something was wrong. But then she exhaled softly and lowered her hands. Still, no sound came. The pause stretched longer, becoming almost uncomfortable. It wasn't dramatic silence, it was something else, something personal. It felt like she was gathering courage, as if the weight of what she was about to share was heavier than anyone could see. And then, finally, her fingers touched the keys. The first sound was soft, barely a whisper, like a sigh that escaped before she could stop it. The melody started uncertainly, trembling slightly as though she was speaking a language she hadn't used in years. A few people in the audience frowned, unsure what to think. But as the notes began to flow, something changed. The music grew steadier, deeper, filled with emotion that was impossible to fake. She wasn't just playing, she was remembering. Each note seemed to carry a fragment of her past, a shadow of pain, a flicker of hope. There was no sheet music before her. Everything came from somewhere deep inside. Her posture was graceful, but her shoulders occasionally trembled. It was as if she was reliving every memory that had brought her to that piano tonight. In the dim light, the silver mask gleamed faintly. Some in the crowd thought it made her look like a spirit from another world. Someone who had walked through fire and come back only to speak through music. A man in the balcony leaned forward, his jaw slightly open. A woman near the stage clasped her hands together and whispered, "It's beautiful." But not everyone was impressed at first. One man, sitting toward the middle, leaned over to his wife and muttered, "It's just dramatic playing. I've heard better." His wife, however, didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on the stage and tears had already started to well up. She couldn't explain why, but something about the music felt heartbreakingly human. The masked pianist played on, unaware of what anyone thought. To her, the audience didn't even exist. It was only her and the piano, a silent conversation between her heart and the sound she was shaping from it. Her hands moved faster now, the music growing in strength. It wasn't perfect in the technical sense. A few notes were slightly off, but that didn't matter. It was the kind of imperfection that made it real. Behind her, the curtains rippled faintly with the draft from the stage lights. Dust particles floated through the golden beam, dancing quietly in the air like faint memories she was trying to chase away. A few minutes into the piece, the audience forgot who they were watching. The mystery of her identity faded. The mask, which had once been the focus of everyone's curiosity, no longer mattered. What mattered was what they were feeling. It was the kind of music that didn't demand attention but earned it quietly. Note by note, somewhere in the back of the hall, A child rested his head against his mother's arm and whispered, "She sounds sad." His mother nodded softly. "Yes," she said, "but also brave." As the melody deepened, the pianist's body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Her breathing grew heavier, her eyes hidden behind the mask, glinting faintly each time she leaned closer to the keys. There was something deeply human about the way she played. Not polished perfection, but raw honesty. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to tell the truth. Every audience member felt that truth differently. For some, it reminded them of someone they had lost. For others, it felt like a song of forgiveness, of letting go after years of holding on too tightly. The hall, once filled with quiet judgment and idle curiosity, now sat frozen in shared silence. By the time the last note faded, the audience had completely forgotten about their earlier whispers. The masked pianist's hands hovered above the keys for a few seconds after she finished, trembling slightly. She didn't stand immediately. She seemed to be gathering herself again, as though the performance had taken something from her. When she finally rose, the light caught her mask again, and for a brief moment her lips curved into a faint, tired smile. No one clapped at first. It wasn't because they didn't want to. It was because they couldn't. They were still caught in the spell of what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed was not empty but full, heavy with emotion. And then, one person stood and began to applaud. The sound broke the trance. Soon the entire hall was on its feet, the applause rising like a wave. The pianist bowed her head gently. She didn't speak, didn't gesture for attention, didn't even seem to take pride in the standing ovation. She simply stood there for a moment, breathing in the sound, and then slowly turned toward the curtain. As she walked off the stage, the audience kept clapping. Some were crying openly. Others stood motionless, still trying to process what had just happened. No one knew who she was. No one knew where she had come from. But everyone knew they had seen something real. Backstage, the dim corridor was quiet except for the soft hum of lights overhead. The pianist removed her gloves one by one, her hands trembling slightly. She rested them against the piano lid, still warm from the performance. For a few moments, she closed her eyes, breathing slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. There were no reporters waiting, no interviews scheduled, no spotlight following her into the darkness behind the curtain, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The performance wasn't for fame or recognition. It was something more personal, a promise kept, a burden lifted. As she stood there, still half in shadow, she could faintly hear the audience calling out for her to return. She almost did, but then she touched the mask on her face and stopped. Not yet, not tonight. The world wasn't ready for her story, and with that she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing softly down the empty hallway. The silver mask glinted faintly in the backstage light before she disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of her music, and a room full of people who would never forget what they had just witnessed. The performance had ended, but the sound of it lingered in everyone's mind long after the masked pianist left the stage. Even as people began to file out of the concert hall, the atmosphere felt heavy, not sad but strangely quiet, like everyone was still trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Some people spoke softly as they walked down the steps outside. Others didn't say a word. They just stared ahead, as if their thoughts were still somewhere inside that hall, trapped between the piano keys and the echo of the final note. One woman, still wiping her eyes, said to her friend, "That music, it felt like she was telling her life story without saying a single word." Her friend nodded. Yeah, it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like pain and healing. The local newspaper reporter, who had come expecting just another show, sat at the back row and couldn't even bring himself to write. His notepad was still blank, his pen resting in his lap. He had been to hundreds of concerts, but this one felt different. It wasn't about skill. It was about soul. Backstage, the masked pianist sat alone on a wooden chair away from the others. Her breathing was still uneven. The faint applause still echoed faintly from the other side of the curtain, but she didn't move. A small bottle of water sat beside her unopened. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she reached up to touch her mask, then stopped halfway as if unsure whether to remove it. Her chest felt heavy, not from nerves but from emotion. Playing tonight had taken everything out of her. It wasn't just another performance, it was something she had feared doing for a very long time. A stagehand passed by carrying a bundle of cables and paused when he saw her sitting there. "You played beautifully," he said softly, unsure if he should disturb her. She looked up at him and gave a small nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." That was all she said. When she finally stood, she walked quietly toward the dressing room at the end of the hallway. The floor creaked under her steps. She could hear muffled voices from the other side of the curtain, people still clapping, calling her back to the stage. But she couldn't go back. Not yet. She reached the dressing room and closed the door gently behind her. For a few moments, she simply stood there staring at her reflection in the mirror. The silver mask stared back at her, reflecting the dim yellow light from the bulbs around the frame. She lifted her hand and slowly pulled it away. Beneath it was a face the world hadn't seen in years. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were filled with a deep sadness. She placed the mask on the table and took a slow breath. In the quiet, she could hear the faint sound of the piano still playing in her mind. The same piece she had performed tonight, a piece she had written herself long ago during the hardest time of her life. It was the melody that had kept her alive when everything else had fallen apart. She sat down, resting her hands in her lap. The gloves were off now, revealing scars, faint but still visible, running across her wrists and fingers. They weren't new. They had faded with time, but they told their own story, one that few people would ever know. Years ago, she had been one of the most promising young pianists in the country. People had called her a prodigy. She had played in packed halls, won awards, and received praise from every direction. But one night, everything changed. It was supposed to be her biggest concert, a performance that would open doors to an international career. She had spent months preparing for it, but just days before the show, she was in a car accident while returning home from a rehearsal. Her hands were badly injured. The doctors told her she might never play again. The world moved on, as it always does. Her fans sent messages at first, then stopped. Her manager found new talent. Her friends drifted away, and she disappeared from the public eye, carrying her pain quietly. For years, she avoided music completely. She couldn't even walk past a piano without feeling a deep ache inside. But the thing about music, especially for someone like her, is that it never really leaves. It waits. It hides in the corners of your heart until one day it calls you back. That day came unexpectedly. She had gone to a small community center one afternoon to help teach children art and music, not as a pianist, but as a volunteer. There was an old upright piano in the corner of the room, its keys yellowed with age. One of the children asked her to play something. She laughed it off at first, saying she couldn't, but the child insisted. So hesitantly she sat down. Her fingers were stiff. The first few notes came out uneven, but then something broke open inside her, a flood of emotion she had been holding back for years. Tears filled her eyes as she played that day, and though her hands ached, she didn't stop. When she finished, the children clapped, smiling wide. They didn't care about mistakes. They just loved the sound. That moment changed her. It reminded her why she had started playing in the first place. Not for fame, not for applause, but because music was the only language her soul truly understood. So, she began practicing again in secret. Slowly, quietly, late at night when the world slept. She had to rebuild everything from the beginning. Her strength, her coordination, her confidence. There were days she cried out of frustration, days she thought of quitting again. But she kept going. And now, years later, she had returned to the stage. Not as the famous pianist the world once knew, but as a masked performer, unknown, unseen, free. The mask wasn't a gimmick. It was protection. She wanted people to hear her without judgment, to feel the music before knowing the story. Outside the dressing room, the applause had finally faded. The theater was emptying out. She stood up, took a final look in the mirror, and whispered quietly to her reflection, "You did it." Her reflection smiled faintly back. She packed the mask into a small bag and wrapped her scarf around her neck before stepping out into the cool night. The air outside was crisp and clean, and the city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. People were still gathered near the entrance of the hall talking about her performance. "She played like her heart was breaking," someone said. Another added, "It felt so real. I've never heard anything like it." She walked past them quietly. No one recognized her without the mask. She slipped through the crowd unnoticed, blending into the night like any ordinary person. But inside her heart was full, not of pride, but of peace. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. As she made her way down the quiet street, she could still hear echoes of the applause behind her. She smiled faintly to herself. Maybe, she thought, this was only the beginning. Maybe the music she had kept locked away for so long was finally ready to be heard again. Not as perfection, but as truth. She paused under a streetlight and looked at her hands. The scars were still there, but they didn't bother her anymore. They were reminders, not of what she had lost, but of what she had overcome. A small gust of wind blew through the street, carrying faint sounds of the city. A car passing, a distant laugh, the rustle of leaves. She pulled her coat tighter around her and began walking again, feeling lighter with each step. Behind her, the concert hall stood tall and silent, its golden lights glowing softly against the night sky. Inside, the piano sat alone on stage, the faint scent of polished wood still in the air. It waited quietly, as if knowing she would return someday, not as the masked pianist, but as herself. And though she didn't know it yet, that performance known that mysterious night was already spreading across the city. People were talking, sharing clips on their phones, posting about the masked pianist who made an entire audience cry. Some claimed to know who she was, others didn't care. What mattered was how the music made them feel. As she disappeared into the night, one thought stayed in her mind. The world had heard her again, and this time, it had truly listened. Days passed after the mysterious performance, but people still couldn't stop talking about the masked pianist. Clips of her playing had begun to spread online. Someone from the audience had filmed a few minutes on their phone, and now the video was everywhere, shared, reposted, replayed millions of times. The title under most videos said the same thing. Masked pianist moves audience to tears. Who is she? No one knew her name, but everyone wanted to. Comment sections filled with guesses and theories. Some people thought she was an old legend returning in disguise. Others believed she was a new talent trying to make her mark. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Her performance was unforgettable. Across the city, people watched her video in coffee shops, living rooms, schools, even on buses. They didn't need to know who she was. The music itself was enough to stir something deep inside them. It was the kind of music that didn't just fill the room, it filled the heart. But while the world buzzed with curiosity, the pianist herself stayed quiet. She didn't check the internet, didn't answer messages, didn't tell anyone who she was. She continued living her simple, quiet life, teaching music to children, walking to the market, practicing alone at night. Yet even in her silence, she could feel the world shifting around her. The small music center where she sometimes volunteered began to receive calls from reporters and talent agencies asking about the masked pianist. The staff, unaware of her secret, simply said they didn't know anything. She had mixed feelings about the attention. Part of her was grateful that people had connected to her music, but another part was afraid. Afraid that if people discovered who she truly was, they would stop listening with their hearts and start judging with their eyes again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in shades of gold and gray, she sat by the piano in her small apartment. The window was open and the faint sounds of the street floated in. Footsteps, laughter, a car passing by. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, playing a soft, unfinished melody. She had written it after the accident years ago, a piece that had never been completed. Every time she tried to finish it, something stopped her. It was as though the last notes were trapped in her memory, waiting for the right time to be released. Tonight felt different. Her hands moved slowly, searching for the right notes, her mind drifting between the past and present. The melody was sad but warm, a song of healing. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel every chord, every vibration of the keys beneath her fingertips. For a moment, she forgot about the mask, the fame, the pain. There was only the music. Then there was a knock at the door. She stopped playing. The sound startled her, sharp, unexpected, cutting through the quiet like a crack of thunder. She hesitated for a moment, then stood and opened it. Outside stood an older man holding a camera and a microphone. He smiled kindly. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm from a local television station. We're doing a feature about that masked pianist who performed last week. People say she changed their lives. You were seen leaving the hall that night. Do you happen to know who she is?" Her heart skipped a beat. She smiled politely, trying to stay calm. "I was in the audience, yes," she said softly. "But I don't know her personally." The man nodded, still smiling. "It's fine. Thank you anyway." He handed her a small card. "If you ever hear anything, please let us know." She closed the door gently after he left and leaned against it, taking a slow breath. The world was searching for her, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay hidden. Later that night, she opened her laptop and saw her face, or rather, her mask, all over the internet. Photos from the concert, videos, fan sketches, even songs inspired by her performance. The comments below were filled with emotion. "She made me cry. I don't even know why. I listen to this every night before I sleep. This music feels like it knows my pain." She read the words carefully, her eyes softening. She had never imagined that her music, something born out of her own struggle, would reach so many people. But mixed in with the love were rumors too. Some said she was a ghost of a pianist who had died years ago. Others claimed it was all a stunt, that the performance was fake. She smiled faintly at that. People always needed to explain what they couldn't understand. The next morning, she visited the small music center again. The children greeted her with bright smiles and energy, as they always did. She helped them practice simple tunes, clapping along when they got the rhythm right, laughing when they hit the wrong notes. "Miss, did you see the video of that masked lady?" one of the little girls asked innocently. "She plays like magic." The pianist smiled. "Yes," she said softly.
"She does?" The girl looked up at her curiously.
"Do you think she'll play again?" "I think," she replied after a pause, "that she's still finding her courage." The little girl nodded seriously, as if she understood. That night, the pianist sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker like stars scattered across the ground. She thought about what the girl had said. Will she play again? The question echoed in her mind. She knew the answer deep down. She wanted to. She needed to. But she was afraid. Not of playing, but of being seen. The mask had given her the freedom to express herself, but it had also become a wall between her and the world. Then, a letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was an invitation, not from a TV show or a record company, but from a small charity organization. They were hosting a benefit concert to raise money for children's hospitals and wanted the masked pianist to perform again. She stared at the letter for a long time. Her heart beat faster. It was the kind of event she had always dreamed of, music that could help others. But performing again meant stepping into the light once more, risking everything she had tried to keep private. She placed the letter on the piano and sat there in silence. For hours she didn't move. The city outside grew quiet and the moonlight filled her small room. Finally, she reached for the keys and began to play. The melody was hesitant at first, then stronger, fuller, braver. The music seemed to answer the question for her. Yes, she would play again. Not for fame, not for recognition, but because her music could still bring hope to others. Over the next few days, she practiced tirelessly. The same nervous energy she had felt before her first concert returned, but it was different now. It wasn't fear that guided her fingers, it was purpose. She even adjusted her mask, adding a faint silver thread along the edge. A small change, but meaningful to her. It reminded her that she was no longer hiding. She was transforming. The night of the benefit concert came sooner than she expected. The venue was smaller this time, a warm, welcoming place filled with people who had come not to judge, but to listen. When she walked onto the stage again, the audience fell silent, just as before. The lights were soft, the air thick with emotion. She sat down at the piano, her hands hovering above the keys, and then she began to play. This time, her music was lighter, more hopeful. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It had softened into something beautiful. The crowd listened, motionless. Some smiled, others cried. The children from the charity sat in the front row, their eyes wide with wonder. As she reached the final notes, she felt tears fill her own eyes. She wasn't just playing anymore, she was healing piece by piece through every sound that left her fingertips. When the music stopped, there was silence again. Then the applause came loud and full of warmth. She looked out at the crowd and for the first time smiled behind her mask. In that moment, she realized something simple but powerful. She didn't need to be seen to be understood. Her story was already written in her music, and the world was finally hearing it the way it was meant to be heard, with the heart. The applause from the benefit concert echoed in her mind long after the lights went down. That night had been different. It wasn't about mystery or curiosity anymore. It was about connection. For the first time, she felt truly understood. People didn't come to see who was behind the mask. They came to feel what she was saying through her music. When she walked backstage after the performance, the volunteers and children greeted her with smiles and hugs. A little boy held out a small drawing. It was of her at the piano, the silver mask shining under the lights. "This is you," he said proudly. "You play happy music now." She smiled warmly and accepted the drawing. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea how much this means to me." The boy nodded, not realizing how true his words were. As she left the concert hall later that night, the cool breeze brushed against her face. She lifted her head toward the dark sky, full of faint stars, and let out a long breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The world finally felt peaceful again. Over the following weeks, life began to change in quiet ways. The video from the benefit concert spread quickly online, just like the first one, but this time something was different. The focus wasn't on her mask or her mystery. It was on her message. People called her the Pianist of Hope. Messages poured in from all over the world. Letters from people who said her music helped them through hard times. Emails from hospitals that played her songs for recovering patients. Teachers saying her story inspired their students to not give up. She read each one slowly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. It was strange, she thought, how her pain had turned into something that could heal others. But even with all the attention, she stayed humble. She still taught at the music center, still walked through the park every morning, still played alone at night. Fame had never been her goal. What mattered to her was honesty, the kind that could only come from music that spoke from the heart. Then, one morning, a letter arrived in the mail that made her pause. It wasn't from a fan or an organization. It was from the director of the National Symphony Hall, the same place where she had performed years ago before her accident. The letter was brief but powerful. "We have followed your journey with admiration. The hall is hosting a special gala next month, celebrating the spirit of resilience in the arts. It would be an honor if you, the masked pianist, would perform as our guest of honor." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. The National Symphony Hall was where everything had ended for her once, and now it was calling her back. For a long time, she just sat there, the letter resting on her lap. The thought of returning to that stage filled her with both excitement and fear. She remembered the bright lights, the roaring crowd, the accident that had taken away her ability to play for so long. But she also remembered the feeling of home that only that stage had ever given her. That evening, she sat at her piano, the same one that had seen her through every high and low. Her reflection in the glossy surface looked calm, but inside she was torn. Could she really go back? She closed her eyes and let her fingers drift across the keys. The sound was soft, like a memory. She played the same piece she had performed at the charity concert, the one filled with hope and light. As the notes filled the room, she realized something. She wasn't that broken girl anymore. The fear, the pain, the silence, they were part of her, yes, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was her courage to return, to keep sharing her music even when it hurt. The decision came quietly. She would go back. The weeks leading up to the gala were filled with rehearsals. She practiced for hours each day, perfecting every note. Her hands still ached sometimes, but she no longer saw that as a weakness. It was simply a reminder of how far she'd come. As the day of the performance drew closer, news of her return spread quickly. Tickets sold out within hours. People wanted to see the masked pianist perform at the same hall where she had once disappeared from the spotlight. The night of the gala arrived. The hall looked just as she remembered, grand, elegant, and filled with energy. The audience was dressed in fine clothes. The chandeliers glowed softly and the air buzzed with anticipation. She stood backstage, wearing her simple black dress and the same silver mask. Her heart raced, but she felt calm at the same time. This was her moment, not of revenge or redemption, but of peace. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special guest, the masked pianist. The applause was warm and genuine. She walked out slowly, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The grand piano waited at the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. As she sat down, she could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. For a brief moment, she looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces all waiting. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The first notes floated through the hall, delicate but strong. It wasn't the same song she had played before. This was a new piece, one she had written in secret over the past few weeks. It told the story of everything she had lived through, the rise, the fall, the silence, and the return. The melody began softly, almost shyly, then grew bolder. The rhythm built like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Every note carried emotion, not sadness this time, but gratitude. People in the audience leaned forward, completely still. Some closed their eyes. The music seemed to reach out and hold them, wrapping them in warmth and calm. As she played, she thought about the accident, about the long nights when she couldn't touch a piano without shaking. She thought about the children she had taught, the strangers who had written to her, and the people who had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. And with every thought, the music grew stronger, brighter. When the final note came, it hung in the air like a prayer. The hall was silent for a heartbeat, and then applause. But this time it was different. It wasn't wild or frantic. It was heartfelt, slow, rising like a wave. People stood one by one, clapping not just for her skill but for her strength. Tears filled her eyes as she stood and bowed. The lights reflected off her mask, and for a moment, she saw her reflection in the glossy piano lid, a reflection of someone who had once been broken but was now whole again. Then, as the applause continued, she reached up and gently removed her mask. A collective gasp filled the hall. Faces turned, cameras clicked, but none of that mattered. Her face was calm, peaceful, shining with quiet pride. Many in the audience recognized her, the pianist who had disappeared years ago after the accident. But no one said a word. They simply watched in silence, knowing that what they were witnessing wasn't just a performance. It was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks, and whispered softly into the microphone, "Thank you for listening, not just to my music, but to my heart." The applause that followed shook the entire hall. It was no longer for the mysterious masked pianist. It was for the woman who had found her way back to herself. That night, as she walked off the stage, she felt lighter than she ever had before. The mask lay on the piano, gleaming under the lights, no longer a symbol of hiding but of everything she had overcome. Backstage, she sat for a moment, still trembling from emotion. One of the staff members approached her quietly and said, "You did it. You came home." She smiled and nodded, her eyes still glistening. "Yes," she said softly, "I did." Outside, the city lights waited for her once again, bright, alive, and full of new beginnings. The night after the grand performance, the pianist didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with echoes of applause and the memory of faces that had stood for her. The sound of that final moment, right when she removed the mask and the hall filled with quiet awe, replayed over and over again in her heart. But what stayed with her most wasn't the applause. It was the feeling of peace that came when she whispered those words, "Thank you for listening to my heart." For years, she had been running from her own story, hiding behind the mask, behind the piano, behind the fear of being seen. Now, for the first time, she had stood in front of everyone as herself. No disguises, no secrets, just truth. The next morning, sunlight filled her small apartment. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, still in disbelief that everything she had dreamed of and feared had come true. Her phone buzzed with hundreds of messages. There were articles about her all over the internet. Masked pianist reveals identity and emotional performance. Return of the forgotten prodigy. Her music made an entire hall cry, but she didn't read most of them. She didn't want to get lost in the noise. Instead, she closed her phone and turned toward her piano. The keys glistened softly in the light. She reached out and touched them, smiling. "We did it," she whispered. For the first time in her life, the piano didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a friend, one that had walked beside her through every storm and brought her home again. In the weeks that followed, life changed in gentle, beautiful ways. She began receiving invitations from orchestras, schools, and organizations around the world. Everyone wanted her to perform or share her story. She accepted a few, but she turned down many. She didn't want to become a celebrity. She wanted to remain human, grounded and real. She started visiting schools, especially the small ones that didn't have much access to music programs. She would sit in classrooms with children who had never touched a piano before and tell them her story. Not the story of fame or mystery, but of failure, pain, and finding courage again. Music doesn't come from perfect fingers, she told them once. It comes from feeling. Even if your hands shake, even if you make mistakes, and none if your heart is in it, people will feel it. The children would listen quietly, eyes wide, and then rush to the piano after her talk, eager to press the keys themselves. The sound of their laughter filled her with something pure and unexplainable. One day, after finishing a visit at a small community school, an elderly man approached her outside. He carried an old violin case and moved slowly, leaning on a cane. "I watched your concert at the Symphony Hall," he said softly. "I used to play long ago. But after I lost my wife, I couldn't bring myself to touch the violin again. That night when you played, I picked it up the next morning." Her eyes filled with tears. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Then the music did its job." Moments like that reminded her why she had chosen to return, not for fame, not for applause, but to remind people of the beauty that still existed in the world. As months passed, she started composing again, but this time, her pieces sounded different. They weren't dark or heavy like before. They were light, filled with air and warmth, as if sunlight had finally entered the notes. She decided to release an album, her first one in years. It was called Unmasked. Each piece told a chapter of her journey, the silence, the fear, the return, and the peace that followed. When the album came out, it wasn't just a success. It was a movement. People from all over shared how it helped them heal, how it gave them courage to start over. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a message. Soon she was invited to appear on television for interviews. But even then she stayed humble. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and smiled with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything. When one interviewer asked her, "What made you finally take off the mask?" she paused for a long time before answering. "I realized," she said, "that I was never hiding from the world. I was hiding from myself. And when I finally forgave myself and for falling, for breaking, for being human, I didn't need the mask anymore." The interviewer nodded, visibly moved, and the studio audience applauded. After the show, she walked out into the street unnoticed among the crowd. She liked it that way, being just another person walking through life. She stopped by a small cafe and ordered her favorite drink, watching people pass by the window. Families laughed, couples held hands, and a street performer played a soft tune on a violin nearby. The world, she thought, was so full of stories. Everyone carried something: pain, joy, loss, hope. And maybe that was what music was for, to remind people that they weren't alone in it. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in warm colors, she walked to the park where she used to sit during her recovery years ago. The same bench was still there, a little worn but steady. She sat down, closed her eyes, and listened to the sounds around her. The rustling trees, distant laughter, a dog barking, the faint melody of someone playing a guitar nearby. For the first time, she didn't think about what came next. She didn't think about concerts or fame or mistakes. She just was. Peace, she realized, wasn't something that arrived suddenly. It grew quietly inside, one breath, one note at a time. A few days later, she received an unexpected letter. It was from a young girl she had met at one of her school visits. The letter was written in careful handwriting. "Dear Miss, I used to be scared to play in front of people because they laughed when I made mistakes. But after I saw your video and met you, I played in the school concert last week. I still made mistakes, but I smiled and everyone clapped anyway. Thank you for showing me that being scared doesn't mean I can't do it." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the little boy's drawing from the charity concert, the one that said, "You play happy music now." She looked at both pieces of paper and smiled. Maybe that was the real reason she had gone through everything, so that someone else could find their voice. Months later, she returned to the same stage where it had all begun, but this time not for a grand concert. The hall was empty. She had asked for permission to come in after hours. She walked to the piano, tracing her fingers along its smooth surface. The lights were dim, the room silent except for her footsteps. Sitting down, she closed her eyes and began to play, softly, gently, almost like a whisper. It wasn't for anyone else this time. It was for herself.